G'day guys, welcome to Military Arts. I'm Phil Bravery, and this is not just another number 1 Mark III short magazine Lee Enfield. It's actually a contract rifle made by the Birmingham Small Arms Factory for the King of Siam in 1920. On the 12th of January 1920, an order was officially received by BSA from the King of Siam, King Rama VI, for 10,000 of these rifles and their bayonets. The contract was officially given the go-ahead by the British government a month later, and the contract was actually completed for all 10,000 units by the end of 1920. Now, curiously, on the collar, that translates to 1919, and it's thought that's because the artwork was done for the rifle in 1919 and not 1920. For Birmingham Small Arms, a contract of 10,000 rifles and bayonets was a gift. At the conclusion of the Great War, a lot of the manufacturing companies had either closed the doors or had diversified into other manufacturing. They were the fortunate ones. In the 1920s, there were only 2 manufacturers of the 303 left, and Birmingham Small Arms happened to be the dominant one, and it actually exported a lot of armoury to foreign governments with the blessing of the British government. It's widely thought that there was a lot of extra time and finesse put in the manufacture of these beautiful rifles, predominantly because of the status of their customer, the King of Siam, King Rama VI, but secondly, their quality control. Birmingham Small Arms, they needed to put their best product out there for repeat business and future clients. There are some myths and rumours, claims, stories that there were more than 10,000 of these rifles made and that they repeat the serial number. However, there is no supporting evidence or reputable source of these claims. There are some instances of minor LSA surplus parts and inspection marks on some of these rifles, but very isolated cases of those. These rifles and bayonets were also known as the Type 62. They were used by the Royal Bodyguard and a volunteer force known as the Wild Tiger Corps. As you can see, that's their standard or their flag behind me. They were a totally independent militia from the Siamese army. The Siamese military, they didn't actually like the Wild Tiger Corps. And upon the death of King Rama VI in 1925, it was disbanded virtually overnight. These rifles are basically a short magazine Lee Enfield, SMLE number 1 Mark III. They use the same materials as those that came before them. The timber is English walnut. The stocks came in all 4 sizes, the bantam, the short, the regular and the long. Unfortunately, I don't have a bantam to show you. The timber looks a little bit darker to what you're normally used to seeing on an SMLE, and that's because the humidity in Thailand played havoc with it. You've got to be careful of timber rot as well. This poor old girl here, she had a little bit of wood rot that we had to repair. Some guys have tried lightening their rifles timber over the years using various chemicals and sanding to bring them back to the original colour with various degrees of success, which is probably one of the nicer things that people have done to their rifles over the years that we'll talk about a little bit later on. Now this is Shiva. I suspect she hadn't been pulled apart in 100 years. Very original. And she had her fair share of pitting and wood rot that we had to overcome. And the rifle, yeah, is pretty worn, but I do like to shoot it every now and again. Probably my favourite out of my collection, and one of the first Siamese smiling tigers that I picked up. Over the years, people have done some horrible things to their rifles, and fortunately, Bubba didn't do too much to this one. He has changed the rear sight guard. Other than that, this poor old Taz here, he's got away from it pretty well. It was given an Australian serial number, and we'll talk about serial numbers again in a minute and how to find them. This old fella Singh, he's had a lot of major work done to him. The only thing left on him original would be the bolt and the receiver. And I personally would not drill a receiver to fit a scope. And I purely bought this rifle for its novelty factor. And it is great fun. Everything else is new parts on it. The nose cap, as you'll see here, it doesn't have a hole for the piling swivel. So it's obviously from a later model rifle. Don't worry about the bipod at the front. That's my doing. It's removable, and we'll talk about that in another video if you guys are interested later on. Numbers are in Siamese script. However, BSA put the English translation underneath it. After I'd gone through everything, Googling numbers from Siamese script to translate to English, we discovered that BSA had actually done it for us, except on the bayonets, which we'll talk about in a minute. On the receiver and the barrel, you will see the Siamese script there. However, here's Diego is modelling his sporting attire. So Siamese up there, English translation underneath. Same on the barrel. Now Diego here was a sporter, a rescue kitty if you like, and I'm in the process of bringing him back to original. Some things I can't do. Someone's put some extra writing on the collar, but that just adds to his character. That bolt that I showed you before is the one that came with him, and just make a note that the cocking piece is not standard. I'm going to have to change that, find an original one. That's what the cocking piece should look like. It shouldn't have the square one on like that one has. As was the timber affected by the humidity of the tropics, so were the leather scabbards for the bayonets. And unfortunately, they didn't survive very long at all. So what they did was they replaced it with sheet metal and replaced the leather. There are a couple of leather ones around. I've seen pictures of them, but they would be very, very rare and very lucky to get one. Maybe one day I will. Another thing to note when identifying these rifles is there is no magazine cutoff, but they do retain the ID disc in the stock. There is another marking, it's just the BSA one, on the collar left hand side. Now with the bayonets, you'll have to translate via Google the Siamese characters. Alternatively, you could use the collector magazine that I showed you before. It has a translation script in there. Now, these were the standard 1907 bayonet, sourced from all different suppliers as surplus after the First World War. They ground off the maker's name. However, I don't know if you can make it out in this one here, but you can sometimes see Wilkinson or the actual manufacturer's name partially ground off or barely visible. That's the only one of mine that you can actually see anything left, any remnants of a manufacturer's thing. And of course, the pretty tiger there as well. It's widely spoken on the forums that the Japanese destroyed numerous amounts of these beautiful rifles during the Second World War. Then in the 1960s, the Thai government gathered up the remainder of the rifles and bayonets and sold them as military surplus to a company called International Firearms America. Now, in the 1970s, International Firearms sold in drops to Australia, into Europe, and into North America. I believe there was also a drop done in the 1980s into the United States. Now, as a collector, this is where I have more questions than answers. How many of these rifles and bayonets did the Thai government actually sell? How many did International Firearms release into the Australian market? How many do they release into the European market? How many do they release into the North American market? I'm sure there are records there somewhere to be found. Unfortunately, I don't have the time or the resources to do that at this stage. However, in saying that, if you were an employee in one of those disposal stores during the 1970s and 1980s in Australia or New Zealand or wherever you were, and you can remember the allotment that you were given of rifles and bayonets, I would really love to hear from you if you can remember seeing them on the floor and looking at the pretty little tigers on the collar. It would be really interesting to hear from you. If you're considering adding a Siamese contract rifle to your collection, there are still a few examples out there. I see them on the forums and in the dealer shops from time to time. If I'm actively looking, I can pick up 1 or 2 a year. Please don't tell my wife. You just got to look for them and know what you're looking at. There are a couple other videos out there on YouTube one's from an American fella from a couple of years back, and another one from a young fella from New Zealand, Oliver. He did a very good one a couple of years ago. Probably some things that I didn't cover on the history of them in his video. You might want to go and check that out. I need to acknowledge Ian Skennington for the use of his resources. Thank you very much, Ian. This is the collector book that relates primarily to these rifles. If you want to know a bit more about them, maybe pick up this book, one with a light horseman on the front. Anyway, that is it from me. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch this video to the end, and catch you again next time.